Welcome, friend. Lie back into the straw and shadows of forgotten centuries. The candle is lit, the hour is late, and the body is still warm. Tonight, we begin a different kind of history. Not a story of kings and battles, but of bones and breath, and what people believed the body could still offer. Once it had stopped moving. This is the quiet, unsettling tale of corpse medicine, where the dead were not buried right away. They were studied, tasted, ground into powders, and stirred into wine, not out of malice, not out of madness, but out of hope. Hope that the body might still heal another. For many centuries in Europe, the line between medicine and the macabre was soft. It wavered like smoke in a cold room. What today might seem impossible or even grotesque was, for them, simple common sense. The body contained force, life force, humours, spirits, and when that life ended, the force did not always vanish. It lingered, seeped, settled in bones, in fat, in the pulse that had only just stopped beating. If one knew how to draw it out, it might still be used. A second life borrowed from the first. This idea was not new. It is older than the word doctor. In ancient Mesopotamia, healers anointed the sick with oils taken from the dead. In Egypt, the body was preserved, not to be feared, but to remain useful. The mummies of pharaohs were not only kept whole as vessels for the afterlife, they were sometimes stolen, ground into powder, and sold across continents. Traders carried these dry remains into apothecaries, where jars were labeled with names like Mumia Vera, genuine mummy. It was prized, expensive. In some towns it cost more than saffron. And why not? Mummies were believed to contain natural bitumen, that dark oily resin thought to have healing powers. To swallow a pinch of it was to drink the residue of ancient royalty, a kind of sacred dust. The Romans had their own methods. In the gladiator arenas, after the clamour of steel and the silence that followed, spectators would sometimes rush down to collect the blood of the fallen. Still warm, still thick with rage and life, they would drink it, sometimes raw, sometimes stirred into wine. Especially those afflicted with epilepsy. It was believed that the vitality of a man who had died violently, who had died with fire in his eyes and movement in his limbs, might restore balance to a body that had lost its way. It wasn't considered wrong. It was considered brave. Even Roman physicians, educated and well-versed in humoral theory, did not always reject these ideas. The body was a site of transformation, a passage. To eat of it was not sacrilege. It was science of a kind. Early versions of it. And while this may seem distant, even absurd, we must remember that they had no antibiotics, no sterile gloves, no certainty, just aching bodies and books full of theories, and so they reached for what they could. These traditions did not die with Rome. They travelled, changed costumes. The early Christian world absorbed some ideas and rejected others. Eating flesh was a delicate matter now. The Eucharist had already shaped people's minds around the concept of sacred consumption. Bread as body, wine as blood. But that was spiritual, symbolic. Still, it planted something. The idea that the body could nourish another beyond its death, that it could be holy, that it could be help. In medieval Europe, medicine was a strange and shifting landscape, filled with saints, snakes, and scribes. And as the centuries passed, the concept of corpse medicine settled into that landscape with quiet persistence. Physicians read Galen and Hippocrates, but they also read Pliny and they memorized charts of humors, hot and dry, cold and wet, but in the corner of their studies they kept jars of bone ash and bottles of blood, just in case. Not every corpse was suitable. Some were better than others. Youth was favored. Sudden death was prized. The body of a man who had died violently was considered especially potent. Executed criminals were often used. Their bodies were public, their deaths official. It was convenient, and so, after the rope snapped or the blade fell, the watchers would gather, not in horror, in hope. A liver might be removed, a strip of skin dried and powdered. Sometimes the fat was rendered into a balm for joint pain, called human grease. It was believed to draw illness from the body like a sponge soaking poison. There were recipes, preserved in the margins of grim medical books. A tincture of blood in wine to warm a cold constitution, powdered skull to calm epilepsy. The moss that grew on a buried man, bones known as usnea, or moss of the skull, was scraped off and steeped into tea. Even the breath of the dying was thought to hold power. If captured in a glass and inhaled quickly, it might ease lung trouble. This is not metaphor. This is recorded. Apothecaries kept quiet shelves of these materials. They sold them discreetly, sometimes with Latin labels, sometimes with symbols. It was not always clear where the ingredients came from. No one asked too many questions. They were for healing. That was enough. And it wasn't always done in secret. Some of the greatest medical minds of the Renaissance discussed corpse medicine openly. Paracelsus, the Swiss physician and alchemist of the 16th century, believed that each body carried a unique signature, a kind of cosmic imprint. He suggested that the essence of a man might be captured and transformed into medicine through alchemical processes. He wasn't alone. Surgeons and scholars debated the best way to extract life from death, to cleanse it, to channel it, to use it. This was not necromancy, not in their eyes. It was closer to chemistry, or even faith. The idea that the body, which had been the vessel of a soul, could not be entirely empty. That something lingered, something useful, something divine. Of course, not everyone agreed. There were critics, clergy who frowned, physicians who scoffed, but none of them could deny the desperation of their time. The plagues, the fevers, the wounds that wouldn't close. If a bit of dried heart might help, who were they to judge? Even as they wrote their sermons or their treatises, they kept their own jars in the cupboard, just in case, and in the quiet, in the corners, the practice continued. It adapted as medicine changed, as knowledge grew. But always beneath it all remained that ancient belief that the body was not just flesh, that it held something more, and that if handled carefully, even death could heal. It's easy to shudder now, to flinch at the idea of swallowing bone dust or stirring blood into your wine. But for them, it was no stranger than leeches or poultices. It was part of the world, a world where the boundary between life and death was thin, where every body held secrets, and every illness was a mystery. In that world, the dead were not gone. They were still helping. So, as we leave this first chapter, remember this. The story of corpse medicine did not begin with horror. It began with hope, strange, tender, and a little desperate. The hope that the body, even in death, might give something back, might ease a pain, might steady a breath, might, in its own way, say, "I am still useful." And the story does not end here. Next, we'll slip into the rooms where these medicines were made, where powders were mixed by moonlight, and blood was bottled before it cooled, because to understand how people healed with the dead, we must first see how they prepared them. The shelves were always quiet, rows of jars, some labeled, some not, some with faint Latin scripts curling across yellowed parchment, others with only a red dot or a sigil scratched into the glass. They stood undisturbed in the cool hush of medieval apothecaries, where light rarely touched the back walls and the mortar never rested long. Here, medicine didn't smell like mint or lavender. It smelled of old cloth, dried iron, and something earthy beneath the herbs, because tucked between the valerian and the wormwood, between the mandrake root and the barley flower, there were things taken not from fields or forests but from bodies. This was the routine magic of corpse medicine, not spoken with fear, not even with wonder, just with practicality. 1 part powdered skull to steady the tremors, a spoonful of dried blood dissolved in wine for the fits, fat render from the thighs of the freshly hanged, rubbed gently into the knees to quiet the ache of years. It was medicine by touch and temperature, by color and decay, guided by books full of quiet instructions that rarely questioned the origin of their cures. The materia medica of the 14th to 17th centuries read like a long, slow inventory of grief disguised as treatment. Compendiums like those by Oswald Crowell, Nicholas Culpeper, and even earlier, the texts that drew from Galenic traditions, all included human substances in their pharmacologies, not in secret, not in footnotes, but in chapters, often with careful diagrams and dosage notes. Take, for example, powdered cranium humanum, skull powder, especially effective, they claimed, when harvested from the skull of a young man who died a violent death and whose body was exposed to fresh air. The bone was boiled, dried, and ground finely, mixed with treacle or syrup. It was administered to epileptics, believed to counter the storm inside the brain, not metaphorically, physically, because the skull once held thought, and therefore, by some distant echo, could quiet it when broken apart. There were classifications. Blood was best taken while still warm, but could be preserved if dried properly. It was stirred into wine or vinegar and sipped in the mornings. Some physicians preferred it taken directly from the neck of a freshly killed criminal. Others settled for dried blood, harvested from linen soaked at execution sites, and then pressed into cakes for travel. The smell was said to be metallic, but tolerable, especially if taken with honey. Human fat or pingado hormonus was more common than one might think. Collected from bodies on the gallows or battlefields, it was often rendered in a slow pan over coals and collected in small ceramic pots. This ointment was prized for arthritis, bone bruises, and persistent cold in the limbs. Applied externally, it was believed to draw out inflammation. Surgeons swore by it. Midwives kept it in their kits. It was thick, pale, slightly yellow, and in high demand. Even sweat had uses, if collected from the brow of the dying, particularly those suffering from fever. It could be used as a sympathetic cure. Rubbed on the chest of someone with consumption, it was thought to transfer the illness or confuse it. Illness, in this theory, could be tricked, distracted, or bribed. It was not just a condition, but a presence, one that could be reasoned with. Teeth had value. Ground into fine powder, human teeth were thought to treat toothaches, which seems both ironic and vaguely. They were dried, crushed, and taken with mother. Some texts recommended soaking them in wine first. Others insisted the teeth of children were best, though it was never quite explained why. The moss that grew on skulls, known sometimes as usnea or skull moss, was gathered with tweezers, found in churchyards, battlefields, or anywhere the dead had long rested above ground. This fine grey-green growth was believed to hold curative powers against nosebleeds and internal bleeding. It was dried, steeped in wine, and consumed on an empty stomach. Apothecaries kept it in paper packets, tucked carefully between herbs and minerals. And yet none of this was considered particularly taboo, not in the way we might imagine. It was medicine, practical, rooted in centuries of slowly accumulated beliefs. The body was seen as a storehouse of energies and fluids. When life ended, those forces didn't vanish. They settled, they cooled, but they remained, waiting for someone with the knowledge or the desperation to use them. Pharmacies across Europe stocked these items with a kind of mundane care. In Nuremberg, in Venice, in Paris, jars labelled with symbols or Latin codes sat beside jars of ground pearls and antimony. The records are clear. Inventories list Mumia vera, real mummy flesh, sold by the ounce. They list sanguis hominus, human blood, preserved in honey or spirits. They list cranium pulveratum, powdered skull, stored in waxed paper or blown glass. And still people came. To buy, to ask, to trust. Because most of them were not rich, not noble, not educated. They were tired, in pain, watching someone they loved slowly vanish behind fevers or tremors or a swelling that would not go down. If someone whispered that a scrap of dried lung or a spoonful of marrow could help, why would they refuse? The physicians didn't always advertise these cures, but they rarely rejected them. Many wrote of them with clinical detachment. The journals of German surgeon Johann Schroeder listed dozens of human-based remedies. English physician Jonathan Goddard created a tincture of skull shavings dissolved in alcohol. It was called Goddard's drops. It was sold in pharmacies well into the 18th century. No one batted an eye. Even royalty used these cures. King Charles II of England is said to have carried a small vial of King's drops, a medicine made from powdered skull, which he took to ward off weakness It was common, unsurprising. The body of a dead man, in this logic, was not a corpse. It was a cure, of course. Some argued. Some hesitated. Theologians debated whether using the body this way disturbed the soul's rest. Physicians questioned the cleanliness, but the objections were soft and often ignored, because the suffering was loud and the remedies were ready. In some places, laws tried to keep up. Authorities debated how to regulate the collection of human remains. Some towns restricted who could take from gallows. Others required permits for graveyard moss. But enforcement was rare. Demand outpaced discomfort, and the jars stayed full. The language used to describe these cures softened them. The word mummy no longer meant a wrapped Egyptian king, but a brown powder used in medicine. Fat became unguent, blood became spirit. It was not about deceit. It was about distance, about making the body easier to consume, easier to believe in. This was not cannibalism in the modern sense. There were no rituals of dominance, no thrill of taboo, just quiet, persistent practicality, a belief that the body could heal the body, that flesh, once used to live, could be used again to save. It is strange, yes, and yet not so far removed. Even today, we take transfusions, grafts, we transplant hearts, livers, skin. We wear the body of another and call it science, because it is. But the medieval world did not separate science from soul. They saw both in every drop. As we leave this second chapter, the shelves grow dim. The jars are back in place. The mortar rests on its side, and the apothecary prepares to close. But before we step away, one thought lingers. These cures were not about horror. They were about hope. However strange, however quiet, however desperate, in the next chapter, we walk beyond the shops and bookshelves into the places where these bodies came from. Not the pharaoh's tombs or the battlefield, but the scaffold, the gallows, the fresh corpse, still warm under the rope. The morning market opens with more than vegetables. In the corner of the square, where the stones stay stained, no matter how often they are scrubbed, a different kind of commerce unfolds. The crowd gathers not for bread or cheese, but for blood, warm, fresh, still humming with the heat of a life just ended. The rope swings slightly in the breeze. Below it, a small wooden bench has been placed. On it, a bowl, a cloth, a cup. The executioner does not speak. He simply waits, because he knows they will come. Across medieval Europe, the scaffold did not end a life and close a chapter. It began a transaction. The executioner's work did not stop with the fall of the blade or the tightening of the knot. It continued into jars, into bottles, into whispered negotiations at the edge of the crowd. The body, freshly stilled, was no longer only a criminal. It was now a resource, a source of medicine, a cure by way of punishment. In many German towns, it became a routine affair. The condemned would be led through the square, the sentence announced, the deed carried out, and then the crowd, if they had gathered early enough, would step forward, not to gawk, not even to mourn, but to collect. A cup of blood sold for a small coin. A strip of cloth soaked in sweat or serum. Pieces of fat sometimes promised in advance, reserved by those with aching joints or old wounds. The transaction was simple. The belief behind it was not questioned, and the man in charge was the executioner. He was not just a hangman. Not only an agent of the court, he was, in his own strange way, a supplier, a kind of unofficial pharmacist, licensed by punishment, trusted, if not loved. The tools he used for killing were sometimes the same. He used for healing the same blade, the same saw, the same hands, calloused and calm, that tied knots and also unwrapped linen for delivery. Some executioners carried notebooks, ledgers with small, tidy script, orders made in advance, names of townspeople who requested fat or bone or gall. The system was quiet but efficient. In Frankfurt, in Nuremberg, in Strasbourg, records show people lining up for what was sometimes called the warm cure, especially for epilepsy, that storm of the body which medieval minds feared most. To drink the blood of a man recently executed ideally, someone young, strong, and not sick was believed to drive out the shaking. Not later, not boiled or aged, but immediately, as close to the last breath as possible. People paid, and people waited. There are descriptions of crowds so eager that they pushed toward the scaffold before the body had even been lowered. In some towns, officials had to set up ropes to keep order, not out of respect for the dead, but to prevent injury among the living. The medical urgency was real, and the belief was widespread, not just among peasants or the desperate, but among physicians, scholars, judges, even clergy looked the other way. Some executioners were paid twice, once by the courts to carry out justice, again by the townspeople for the use of the remains. And while the job was still stigmatized few, executioners were invited to dine with neighbors. They were also tolerated, necessary, quietly useful, and so a strange economy bloomed in the shadow of justice. The idea, of course, was not new. As we've seen, ancient cultures believed that power lingered in violent death, that the force of a soul leaving the body, especially through force or punishment, could be harnessed. The Romans whispered of gladiator blood curing epilepsy. Later centuries adjusted the language, but kept the logic. Violence as vitality, pain as potency, death as dosage. The scaffold became a pharmacy. Temporary, brutal, but well attended. Some towns even developed a kind of rhythm around it. The days of execution were not only civic rituals, they were medicinal events. Notices were posted, word of mouth spread, families gathered, not just to witness justice, but to collect hope in a cup. There were instructions, too, how to use the products correctly. Blood should be taken warm, drunk immediately. The taste was said to be metallic, sharp, not pleasant but bearable. Fat should be rendered slowly, not scorched. Bones needed to be dried and ground. Executioners sometimes performed these processes themselves or handed the materials off to trusted apothecaries. The chain of custody was informal but understood. In France, the situation was similar. Executioners in Paris kept small booths near Plessis. After beheadings, they sold parts to physicians, midwives, or individuals in need. The practice was not regulated, it was simply known, and while some physicians later condemned the practice citing concerns about hygiene or sacrilege, many participated, or at least did not protest. This was not an act of cruelty. No one believed they were dishonoring the dead. The condemned were, by definition, considered outside the usual protections. Their bodies were already public property, already marked by judgment, and so to use them for healing was, in some minds, a final service, a kind of balance. Pain transferred into comfort, one life ending to soothe another. Still, not everyone benefited. The rich did not often wait in public squares. They had access to private physicians, private stocks. Their corpse medicine came prepackaged, processed, dried, sent with a label and a wax seal. The poor, meanwhile, waited in the cold, pressed forward when the signal was given, tried not to drop the cup. Women came often, mothers with children who seized in the night, wives with husbands too stiff to walk, old women with their own pains and a lifetime of herbal knowledge, willing to try one more thing. They did not weep, they did not flinch, they simply came forward, placed their coins on the wood, and received what they came for. Executioners developed reputations. Some were kind, some were cruel, some quick with the blade, others known to delay if the crowd wasn't ready. A few even wrote their own instructions, small scrolls passed along with the remedy. Drink by dawn, boil with barley, keep from light. The advice was rarely scientific, but always earnest. Not all cities allowed it. Some towns banned the sale of remains outright. But enforcement was inconsistent. Laws passed in the morning were ignored by twilight. Medicine, after all, cared little for legality. It cared for results, and stories of healing of a child who stopped shaking, of a man who stood against spread faster than ordinances. The ethics were rarely discussed. The dead were already condemned, their fate sealed, and if their bodies could ease suffering, why not use them? It was not cannibalism in the ritual sense. It was medicinal. Clergy disagreed among themselves. Some condemned it quietly, others rationalized it as charity, and so the scaffold remained not just a place of ending, but of exchange, a site where pain turned to promise, where crowds gathered not only to watch, but to hope. Not everyone was saved. The remedies failed more often than they succeeded, but still they came. Because when the usual cures failed, when prayers had worn thin, there was always the rope and the man who stood beside it. As we leave this chapter, the square is emptying. The bench is wiped clean. The rope hangs still, and the jars are full again, not with fear, not with vengeance, but with the strange, silent hope that the body anybody might yet offer help. Next, we'll descend into the anatomy rooms, not the public squares, but the hidden spaces where corpses were dissected by candlelight, where scholars drew diagrams from flesh and called it learning, where the body became not just medicine, but map. There are places where the sand never forgets, where the wind passes over old stone and stirs not just dust, but names. Names of men and queens and scribes and embalming priests, names folded into linen and resin and sealed away beneath the desert for centuries. In the dry silence of Egyptian tombs, the dead once waited for eternity. But eternity, as it turned out, had a shipping schedule. Long before European apothecaries ever labeled jars with words like Mumia Vera, caravans were already moving. Not just spices and silk and glass beads, but something more brittle, something darker, wrapped in cloth, then canvas, then crated for ships. The bodies of ancient Egyptians began their second lives, not as kings, but as cures. By the time the Renaissance opened its hungry eyes to the past, mummy flesh had become a commodity, a medicine, a rumor of immortality powdered into teaspoons. The idea that Egyptian mummies held healing power was not born in Europe, but it found its most eager customers there. The logic was ancient. If a people could preserve their dead for thousands of years, then surely some of that longevity lingered in their flesh. Some called it magical. Others called it scientific. Most didn't ask. They simply bought what they were told would heal. The word mumia was confusing from the start. In Arabic, it referred to bitumen, the thick black resin found in natural deposits and used in somewhere along the way, Europeans began to conflate the resin with the bodies it preserved. And then, as merchants saw the growing demand, they simply merged the two. Mumia became not just the substance, but the whole thing. Flesh, bandage, resin, and rumor ground together into a dark, bitter powder. Apothecaries stocked it in little packets. Some labeled it with its source. Most did not. Some came from genuine Egyptian tombs, others from local graves. Forgery was common. Bones of beggars sold as those of pharaohs, corpses steeped in pitch and wrapped hastily to mimic the texture of the real thing. The truth mattered little. What mattered was the label Mumia. Authentic or not, it sold. In Venice, in Florence, in Marseille, ships unloaded crates of human remains. Merchants paid handsomely for access to older tombs, hiring locals to retrieve whatever they could under the cover of night. Egyptian authorities turned a blind eye or participated outright. The trade was brisk, the profits substantial. Even as tombs emptied, demand only grew. European physicians prescribed mumia for everything from bruises to consumption. Ground into wine or mixed with honey, it was believed to purge impurities. Applied as a salve, it was said to draw out infection. The scent was said to be earthy, slightly sweet, reminiscent of myrrh and rot. Recipes varied. Some called for powder only. Others insisted on small chunks, chewed slowly before sleep. Artists used it too. The pigment mummy brown, popular in the 17th century, was literally made from crushed mummy flesh. It produced a warm, rich tone, unlike any other. Paintings of saints and sinners alike were colored with the remnants of ancient nobility. Even as they decorated altars, the dead adorned the canvas. The symbolism was thick. Egypt, long viewed by medieval and Renaissance thinkers as the cradle of wisdom, became the pharmacy of eternity. Its dead, preserved by secrets unknown to Christian Europe, were imagined as repositories of ancient knowledge. Ingesting that flesh, in some twisted echo of communion, was believed to transfer not just health, but insight, wisdom through digestion, immortality in powder form, and yet it wasn't seen as macabre. Not widely, not publicly. This was medicine, sanctified by age, by distance, the fact that the bodies were faunt and Christian, ancient, exotic made, the practice less fraught, or at least less discussed. The dead of Europe might have demanded respect. The dead of Egypt were something else, history made edible. Not everyone agreed. Some scholars warned against the moral decay of consuming human flesh, no matter how old. Others questioned the efficacy. By the late 16th century, a few voices began to rise, doubting the origin of much of what passed for mummies. William Harvey, who later discovered the circulation of blood, dismissed it as superstition. But for centuries before that, the doubt remained a whisper. The trade continued. Travelers wrote of entire markets in Cairo and Alexandria where mummy parts were sold beside incense and papyrus. They described the texture of the flesh, the sharpness of the resin, the way merchants packed the limbs to prevent breakage. Some noted the presence of European buyers hovering at the edges, waiting to haggle. It was an open secret. The tombs were not sacred. They were supply. Back in Europe, physicians codified dosages, apothecaries kept ledgers, the dead passed through customs, slowly. The spiritual story of Egypt, its gods, its rituals, its golden promises owes reduced 2 ounces, and coin, an arm here, a torso there, all rendered, measured, and consumed. The trade even inspired fraud. In Syria, in Anatolia, and even in parts of Eastern Europe, bodies were artificially aged, coated in resin, wrapped in cloth, dried in ovens, sold as Egyptian. The line between medicine and grift grew thin, but the demand was strong enough to support it, and so the desert winds carried more than sand. They carried names, erased now, faces, ground into pigment, histories, swallowed with wine. The people who once built pyramids, who prayed to Anubis, who etched stories into tomb walls, now passed anonymously into the bloodstreams of strangers far away. Their eternity, once promised, was spent in dozers. Eventually, the tide began to shift. By the 18th century, critics gained ground. Medical journals began to question the value of mumia. New medicines emerged. Scientific methods improved. And slowly, the jars disappeared from pharmacy shelves. The pigment fell out of favor. The trade declined, not ended by outrage, but by obsolescence. Today, we look back with discomfort, with confusion, but also, perhaps, with a strange respect for the logic of desperation. The dead, after all, had long been considered powerful. If not through prayer, then through presence. The body, intact and ancient, held meaning. And in a world where medicine often failed, where hope came in powder and myth, the idea of ingesting history didn't feel so strange. In museums now, what remains of the trade sits behind glass. Shards of bandage, scraps of coffin wood, notes from apothecaries listing the prices paid for skulls and femurs, a quiet archive of human curiosity stretched too far. And Egypt itself remembers, not in grief, perhaps, but in patience. The tombs still whisper, The sand still covers and uncovers in cycles, and somewhere, in the deep silence of those desert places, the dead remain, still embalmed, still waiting, no longer for resurrection, but for rest. In the next section, we move from powdered myth to dissected reality, from tombs and trade routes to the quiet rooms, where scholars cut into the newly dead, not to heal, but to understand, where knowledge was carved into being with knives, and where the line between reverence and curiosity grew thin beneath the candlelight. Francis I of France kept a pouch of powdered mummy near his bedside. Not a souvenir, not a curiosity, but a medicine. He believed, like many around him, that the remains of the ancient dead, especially those embalmed and preserved, carried vitalitaire, energy, something stolen from time itself. When his joints ached or his strength faltered, he would ask for the powder, sometimes sprinkled into wine, sometimes mixed with syrup, swallowed without question. Charles II of England was even more enthusiastic. Blood warmed the spirit, fat eased external pain, skull dust treated epilepsy and melancholy. Crowell was no fringe figure. He advised nobles, taught students, was widely read. His recipes circulated through apothecaries like gospel. Paracelsus, that great mystic of Renaissance medicine, agreed in part. He believed that the body contained inner fire, that the spirit left traces behind in flesh, and that this spirit could be consumed not in ritual, but in treatment. In the centuries where bells marked both mass and execution, the body was a holy thing, created by God, animated by soul, destined for resurrection. This was not metaphor. It was doctrine. The body was a temple, the flesh sacred, the bones a future vessel for eternity. And yet, on quiet afternoons behind monastery doors and in the back rooms of cathedrals, these same bodies were boiled, dried, powdered, and prescribed. The contradiction sat unspoken, like incense in still air, too heavy to ignore, too useful to confront. The Church had long condemned cannibalism, not just in action, but in imagination. To consume human flesh willingly, even in desperation, was a mortal sin. It was associated with heresy, with madness, with the outer edge of human behavior. In stories, it was the mark of the damned. In doctrine, it was an act that severed the soul from grace. And yet, as corpse medicine became more common across Europe, the clerical response was not thunderous condemnation. It was something quieter, a studied silence. It wasn't that church officials didn't know. They did. Apothecaries supplied monasteries. Priests administered tinctures made from human remains. In some cases, shirt-sewn hospitals kept records of corpse-based treatments. They noted the dosage, the recovery time, the cost. The body of Christ was not the only flesh that passed the lips of the faithful. But unlike the Eucharist, this flesh was never spoken of in sermons. There were attempts to reconcile the difference. Some theologians argued that corpse medicine was not consumption in the sinful sense. It was medicinal. The intent was not to desecrate, but to heal. In moral theology, intention mattered, and the dead used in these cures were not killed for food. They were already gone, their flesh a resource, not a victim. Some even framed it as charity, the dead serving the living in one final act of usefulness, a sanctified recycling. Others, particularly in Protestant circles, were less comfortable. As the Reformation broke open the old unity of the Church, new questions emerged. If Rome endorsed the use of relics, bones, and blood of saints as spiritual conduits, was corpse medicine not just an extension of that logic? Protestants, who rejected the veneration of relics, often condemned corpse medicine alongside it. They called it idolatrous, superstitious, a corruption of both science and faith. But even then, the condemnation was selective. In Lutheran regions, some physicians quietly continued the practice, framing it not as religious but rational. In Calvinist circles, stricter views on bodily integrity led to more hesitation, and yet none of these divisions produced a consistent stance. Instead, they produced a patchwork. In some towns, a priest might condemn human fat in ointment, while using powdered skull in his tea. In others, a bishop might decry the trade of relics, while approving a hospital order for man's grease. The body of doctrine bent to the body in need. Part of the confusion lay in the nature of Christian sacrifice. The central ritual of communion involved the symbolic consumption of flesh and blood. It was sacred, but also strange, especially to outsiders. Accusations of cannibalism had haunted early Christians in Roman times. Now, centuries later, real consumption of real bodies blurred the metaphor. Theologians stepped carefully. Too much criticism of corpse medicine, and they risked drawing attention to the weirder parts of their own liturgy. There was also the question of consent. The saints whose relics were venerated were believed to have consented in spirit. Their remains were not just dead matter, they were living vessels of grace. But the corpses used in medicine were anonymous. Criminals, outsiders, foreigners, Egyptians, heretics, people without names, without relic status. This lack of sanctity made them usable, but also untouchable. No need for reverence, no requirement for ritual. Their flesh was not holy, just useful. This theological loophole allowed the practice to continue without official endorsement. It was never declared righteous, never declared evil, just not mentioned. The Church's silence was practical. To forbid the use of corpse medicine outright would have required banning practices that were deeply embedded in both secular and religious medical care, and for all its heavenly goals, the Church still ran hospitals, still treated plague, still tried, in its own way, to keep bodies alive. And so the clergy administered last rites to patients, while apothecaries applied salves made from human remains. Confessions were heard as tinctures of blood were swallowed. The sacred and the macabre existed side by side, separated only by tone, by the softness of a whisper, by the turning of a page. In Catholic Spain, records show that some monasteries purchased mumia from North African traders. In Italy, churches near hospitals often hosted both relic processions and corpse medicine distribution on the same day. One room for prayer, one room for poultices. No contradiction, at least not out loud. The Jesuits, ever meticulous, occasionally debated the theological implications. A few treatises survive, raising quiet concerns. Was using human bone powder a desecration of the image of God? Did the practice echo pagan rituals? Was there a risk of scandal? The responses were measured. The practice, they concluded, was not ideal, but neither was it heretical, as long as the intent remained healing and not hunger. It could be. For the Church, this silence was a strategy. Noise drew attention. Debate opened doors. And the truth was, people needed healing, especially the poor, who lacked access to newer remedies, especially the clergy themselves, who aged and ached like anyone else, and so the jars remained on the shelves. The powders passed through fingers, the prayers continued, and the contradictions stood quietly in the back pew, unacknowledged but undeniable. Over time, the growing influence of Enlightenment thinking began to erode this silence. As science detached itself from theology, the justifications grew thinner. Physicians stopped citing spiritual essence. They spoke instead of empirical evidence. And when that evidence failed to support the efficacy of corpse medicine, the practice slowly waned. Not from outrage, not from revelation, but from error. Even then, the Church rarely commented. No grand statements, just a quiet retreat, a slow exhalation, as if a long tension had been held and finally released, as if the flesh had served its purpose and could be allowed to rest. Today, the archives hold the echo. Letters between monks, discussing dosages, ledgers listing pulvis ex ossibus, marginalia in sermons, carefully scratched out. The silence, in retrospect, was not empty. It was full of hesitation, of internal debate, of human frailty pressed against divine ideal, and perhaps that's the truest theology. Not certainty, but contradiction, not dogma, but doubt. A body said to be sacred, yet used like soil. A death said to be honored, yet ground into powder. A church meant to guide, caught instead in a long and awkward pause. In the next section, we move away from pulpits and powder jars into the homes of the common folk, where healing didn't come from mummies or universities, but from what could be gathered, borrowed, or whispered at midnight. A world of bone charms, burial dirt, and mothers who stirred their teas a little too carefully. It always began in the kitchen, or in the garden, or in the damp root cellar where jars lined shelves like quiet ghosts. For most people in medieval Europe, healing was not a matter of scholars or scripture. It was a matter of knowing where the herbs grew, of remembering what grandmother once said when the baby wouldn't stop crying, of taking what could be found and making it do. Beneath the bright chatter of noble physicians and the stern declarations of clerics, there was another kind of medicine, one passed in whispers, one that belonged to women who knew which bones to boil and which flowers to leave untouched. This was not the corpse medicine of apothecary shops. It did not arrive wrapped in Latin. It was not labelled with ink or sealed with wax. It came instead from stories, from customs too old to trace, from midwives who did not call themselves doctors, but who held more bodies in their arms than any man with a university degree. These women's, sometimes praised, sometimes feared, held the knowledge of flesh and rot and renewal in their fingers, and when they needed to ease pain or banish fever or keep a mother from slipping after childbirth, they used what they had, which sometimes meant the dead. Take the moss of the gallows. It was said that if you scraped the green fuzz from the wood beneath a hanged man's feet and boiled it into a tea, it could stop bleeding, not because of chemistry, but because of something stranger. The man had died suddenly. Without warning, his soul startled from his body like a bird. The moss, feeding off that moment, took in a kind of power, and so it could be used, carefully, only by those who knew how to whisper to it first. Or skull cups. Hollowed bits of cranium used to serve herbal brews. It was not just about the vessel. It was about the idea that drinking from the dead could carry their strength into your own bones, especially if the skull belonged to someone strong, a soldier, a man who had never lost a fight. The skull was passed down, never mentioned to the priest, and always stored in a clean linen cloth. It was not shown to neighbours, but it was used. When needed, then there was corpse fat, rendered in secret, stirred slowly over fire with rosemary, and beeswax to make a salve, applied to bruises, to broken bones, to joints that refused to bend in winter. The fat came from unclaimed bodies, or from the executed, not stolen, just collected quietly, because the healing came from what the body had already given up. No harm done, no soul disturbed. Only the warmth that lingered in the flesh, coaxed into one last act of usefulness. Folk healers did not write treatises. Their recipes were passed from mouth to mouth. No measurements, only memory. A pinch of this, a finger's length of that. Stir until the spoon says stop. Many of the ingredients were mundane. Willow, bark, nettle, lavender, but sometimes, in the back of the cupboard, wrapped in cloth and string, There was something darker, a dried fingertip, a scrap of hair from a drowned man, a sliver of bone soaked in vinegar until it turned soft, enough to grind. Not for common ailments, not for colds or coughs, but for the things that wouldn't go away, the fevers that came in dreams, the shadows that followed children home from the woods. These traditions were not uniform. Every village had its own law. Some said the third vertebra of a dead child could cure seizures. Others swore by ash from the foot of a burned witch, mixed with goat milk and swallowed at dawn. The logic made no sense to outsiders, but it worked often enough to keep the stories alive, and there was reverence. A quiet kind, no candles, no psalms, but a way of folding the cloth with care, of not speaking the name of the dead when using what they had left behind. It was not theft, not in their eyes. It was exchange. The dead gave what they could. The living received it with respect, sometimes with fear, always with gratitude. Midwives, especially, stood at the crossroads of birth and death. They knew the feel of cooling flesh, the sounds a body made as it slipped away. They also knew how to bring the blood back to the cheeks of the nearly gone. They kept dried umbilical cords in pouches, collected afterbirths for rituals. They whispered to the bellies of pregnant women, and when things went wrong, when the baby did not cry or the mother would not stop bleeding, they did what they had to. Sometimes that meant reaching into the cupboard for the little jar no one else touched. The church watched, sometimes, with one eye. Officially, many of these practices were condemned. Superstition, witchcraft, evidence of the devil's meddling. But priests also came to the midwives when their own sisters took ill. They did not always ask what was in the poultice. They did not always want to know, because when a child convulsed in the night, or a man could no longer stand from his bed, doctrine bent beneath desperation. Some folk healers were punished, burned, banished, accused of using the dead for evil. But most were left alone, too useful, to lose, too feared to cross. Their reputation hung somewhere between medicine and myth. Their tools hidden behind jars of honey and garlic. Their knowledge carried not in books, but in calloused hands and the rhythm of old songs. There were charms, too. Bits of bone worn around the neck, teeth sewn into dollies to protect children, pieces of shroud tucked beneath mattresses to prevent nightmares. These were not cures. They were preventions. Small negotiations with fate. Keep the bad things out. Hold the good things in. Folk logic rarely asked why. It simply remembered what had worked. Travelers sometimes brought new ideas. From the Black Forest, from the Highlands, from the misty corners of Eastern Europe where the dead were said to walk again. New recipes joined the old ones. A spoonful of dirt from a grave, a drop of water that had touched a corpse's lips, not always literal, sometimes symbolic, but always tinged with that strange, dark hope that the body could still give something after its soul had gone. And these ideas lingered long after formal medicine moved on, long after universities dismissed the powders and the potions. In cottages and farmhouses and rooms, warmed only by breath, the jars remained. The whispers continued, not loud, not proud, just there. Like the rustle of dried herbs, like the hush of wind through old trees. In folk traditions, the line between medicine and magic was never drawn with ink. It was felt, it was held. The dead were not feared as much as forgotten. And so, using their remains was not sacrilege. It was memory. It was need. It was what you did when the doctor was 3 villages away, and the baby's fever had not broken for 2 nights. There was wisdom in it. Uneasy, earthy wisdom. Not always safe. Not always clean. but built on experience, on pattern, on care taken, in dark rooms when no one else would come. The whispering apothecaries may not have worn robes or taken oaths, but they held healing in their fingers. And sometimes they held the dead too. It didn't start with a bang. It never does. The end of corpse medicine began in whispers too, but different ones. Not from midwives or monks this time, but from men with lenses and scalpels. Men who walked slowly through anatomical theatres and frowned not out of disgust, but from doubt. Doubt had begun to seep in. It came softly at first, like damp creeping beneath a door. Not to destroy, not to accuse, just to ask, does this actually work? By the late 17th century, Europe had started to tilt. Not away from superstition, entirely no, not yet, but toward something colder. Enlightenment, they would call it. As if minds could be lit like lanterns and reason could be poured into rooms once crowded with ghosts. In this new light, old things began to look strange. The dried blood, the moss from gallows, the tiny jars marked pulvis humanis, still sitting on apothecary shelves, still sold in reputable towns, still administered to royalty and beggars alike. But something had changed. Scholars began to ask what blood did. Not symbolically, not spiritually, but physically. Why did it stop flowing? What made it clot? What lived inside it? When physicians first peered through primitive microscopes and saw red cells, small floating discs, they did not know what they meant. But they knew the sight was real. Measurable, flesh, once sacred mystery, had become matter, and matter could be tested. If human fat cured joint pain, then why? If powdered skulls stopped bleeding, then how? When no answers came, only stories, rituals, silence, the newer minds grew uneasy. They didn't mock, not yet. But they turned their attention elsewhere. 2 tinctures made from bark, 2 trials with quinine, 2 dissections and chemical theories. Slowly, method began to replace myth. Still, the old ways clung. In Germany, apothecaries continued to stock mummies. In France, bones were ground for medicine well into the 18th century. Even in England, dried human flesh, sourced from criminals, was listed in official pharmacopoeias. This wasn't fringe behavior. It was institutional. But the energy had shifted. Once, corpse medicine had lived in the hopeful hands of healers. Now, it lingered like something no one had the heart to clear away. Resistance came not just from science, but from morality. As early as the 1600s, writers began to question the ethics. Was it right to consume the dead, even if it healed? Especially if the dead could not consent. The old arguments, charity, usefulness, the dead giving to the living, began to feel thin. One German physician, writing in 1679, declared the practice a shame to the Christian conscience. Not because it was ineffective, but because it was unkind. Public sentiment began to turn. Not all at once, but in the way rumors sour into revulsion. Travellers visiting apothecaries recoiled at the smell of preserved flesh. Letters describe visitors fainting at the sight of dried limbs hanging behind counters. These were not the reactions of the past. 100 years earlier, such sights had inspired awe. Now, they bred unease. The trade in mummies, once brisk and booming, began to collapse. Egyptian tombs, long plundered for medicinal treasure, became protected curiosities. Scholars argued over preservation, not ingestion. The mummy, once ground into powder and stirred into tea, was now locked behind glass. Its symbolism had changed, from remedy to relic, from source of vitality to historical artifact. And with this shift, the apothecaries, who still sold powdered flesh, found themselves looked upon with growing suspicion. It wasn't just academics. Poets weighed in, satirists skewered the hypocrisy. Why was it noble to consume saintly bones for healing, but abhorrent to eat the flesh of an executed criminal? Why was God silent on this one strange hunger? Writers poked at the absurdity. Plays featured apothecaries hawking powdered toes and marrow pills. The audience laughed, uneasy, because the joke was still real. Even the medical texts began to revise. By the mid-1700s, new editions of Materia Medica quietly removed corpse-based entries, not with fanfare, just with absence. A chapter gone, a footnote deleted. Apothecaries were not banned from selling these things, but they were no longer encouraged, no longer held up as standard. The silence that had once enabled the practice now helped bury it. In private, some doctors confessed that they still believed. Not out of stubbornness, but out of experience. They had seen the poultices work. They had watched wounds close after, being treated with salves of rendered fat. They had given patients blood tinctures and seen seizures ease. But they could no longer explain it. And without explanation, they could no longer teach it. And without teaching, the practice withered. Some blamed fashion. Enlightenment thinkers wanted clean lines, logical sequences. They looked down on mess, on rot, on the human body as anything other than a machine. To them, corpse medicine reeked of older times, of folk memory, of the irrational, but others knew the truth was simpler. Medicine had moved on. It had found new hopes, and the old ones, once so powerful, were simply forgotten. Yet, even into the late 18th century, the jars remained. In the corners of certain shops, behind the rosemary and sage, a tiny scrap of flesh, a pinch of skull, a memory of when medicine tasted like history. Some customers still asked, some healers still offered, especially in rural places, far from cities, far from the gaze of philosophers. In these places, the dead still gave to the living, not as scandal, but as tradition. It is worth remembering that belief does not disappear when it is disproven. It fades, it adapts, it lingers in corners. The Enlightenment did not burn the old books, it simply stopped reading them. And those who had learned to whisper their cures kept whispering, even if no one listened. There were also holdouts in respectable circles. Well into the 19th century, European hospitals still used certain corpse-derived substances. Blood transfusion remained controversial. Organ transplants were unimaginable. But tinctures and salves, passed down from older formularies, still held traces of the past. These were not celebrated, but they were used, quietly, as if the dead might still help, even if the textbooks no longer said so. And then, slowly, the jars were emptied, the powders thrown away, the bones buried again. Not with ceremony, but with the tired sigh of a profession that had grown tired of defending itself. Corpse medicine had not failed. It had simply aged out of fashion, replaced by vaccines, by antiseptics, by surgeries that cut with precision instead of prayer. Today, we look back with curiosity, sometimes horror, sometimes wonder. How could they eat flesh to heal a cough? How could they drink blood and call it mercy? But we forget how little they had, how much they needed to believe, and how fragile the line is between science and faith when a child is sick or a loved one dying. Corpse medicine did not vanish, it transformed. Modern medicine still draws from the body. Organ donation, blood banks, skin grafts. We speak now in terms of ethics and consent. We sign papers, we store parts in sterile bags. But the impulse is the same. The body still heals. The body. We have simply learned to ask permission first. In the next and final section, we will rest with these stories. No longer trying to justify them, no longer tracing them forward, just letting them settle. Like dust over a long shelf of forgotten cures, we'll close the apothecary door, blow out the candle, and lie quietly beside the bodies that once healed us. It begins and ends with the body, that soft structure of flesh and bone and breath. For all the books and scrolls and sermons that piled up through the centuries, it was always the body that remained constant, warm or cold, whole or broken, a mystery too familiar to ignore. For medieval people, the body was not just a vehicle, it was scripture, it was fear, it was hope pressed into skin. And when medicine reached its limit, when words and prayers ran out, they turned back to what was already there. The body itself, the source, the remedy. To eat the dead is a shocking idea to us now. We flinch, we recoil. But the people who did, it rarely did so with malice or madness. They were not monsters. They were parents and widows and soldiers and apothecaries. They reached into graves and tombs and gallows, not to desecrate, but to survive. The difference between healing and horror is thinner than we like to believe. It lives in context, in desperation, in centuries with no antibiotics and no anesthetic, in candlelit rooms where children burned with fever and mothers bled quietly into straw beds. Corpse medicine made sense to them. Not because it was logical, by today's standards, but because it fit into the shape of their world. The dead were not gone. They lingered. In dreams, in relics, in the corners of churches. Their presence was both sacred and useful. A saint's bone could bless a town. A criminal's fat could soften a wound. A dried heart could protect a traveler. Death was porous. The veil thin, one body ending didn't mean its story did. We forget how closely they lived beside death. It did not hide in hospitals. It walked the streets. It rang church bells. It was stitched into lullabies. The living and the dead were neighbors, sometimes even roommates. And so taking something from the dead did not feel like theft. It felt like inheritance, like borrowing fire from a candle already extinguished, just enough to light one more night. They didn't have the luxury of metaphor. Their healing was physical, tactile. The same hands that buried the dead sometimes stirred their ashes into wine. It was not an act of cruelty. It was grief looking for something to hold. And in a world where illness could arrive in a single breath, people held tight to whatever worked, or seemed to work, or once worked for a neighbor's cousin's child. In the face of unknowing, repetition becomes ritual, and ritual becomes belief. But it wasn't just desperation. There was also awe, a sense that the body contained mysteries we still haven't unlocked, that somewhere in the marrow and bile and breath there was something sacred. Not in spite of death, but because of it. Eating the dead to heal the living was not always about science. Sometimes it was a form of prayer, a way of honoring the terrible beauty of mortality, of saying, we are made of each other. We return to each other, even now, even in this. And it was not so different from other forms of medicine. Even today we consume the body in gentler ways. We take blood, we share organs. We accept skin and marrow from strangers we'll never meet. We do it with signatures and hospitals and sterile gloves. But the principle remains. The body heals. The body. We just wrap it in paperwork now and call it donation. What corpse medicine reveals is not a failure of science, but a portrait of human longing. The longing to stay, to recover, to help someone else recover, even if it means using what was once someone else. They were not fools. They were simply alive. in their time, in their way, trying to outlast the dark. These remedies were not always effective. Many did nothing. Some caused harm. But that was true of all medicine then, and still sometimes now. What mattered was the act, the gesture, the belief that something could be done, that the dead could give one last gift, that the body was not finished just because the soul had left. It's tempting to look back and laugh, to see powdered skulls and gallows moss, and think only of absurdity. But beneath the strangeness lies a kind of tenderness, an ache to mend what was broken, using the only tools they had, flesh, faith, memory. And memory lingers longer than medicine. The jars may be empty now, the shelves cleared, but the stories remain, in museum corners, in old herbals, in whispers between pages, a recipe here, a mention there. Enough to remind us that even the strangest parts of history were once someone's comfort, someone's last hope. We carry that impulse still. We touch the hands of the dying. We keep locks of hair. We speak the names of the dead aloud, as if that might hold them close a moment longer. Corpse medicine was just one more version of that. One more way to say, I am not ready to let go. One more way to believe in healing, even when it came from ashes. And maybe there's wisdom in it, not in the powders, not in the recipes, but in the willingness to keep trying, to use what's left, to find warmth in the coldest things. The heart of corpse medicine was not death. It was love, odd, awkward, unspoken love. That quiet insistence that something could be salvaged, that no one is useless, not even after . So we end here, with a shelf of empty jars, with old books closed, with candles blown out. We have wandered through powder and blood and superstition, through gallows and churches and kitchens full of forgotten recipes, and all along the question was never really whether corpse medicine worked. It was what it meant that people believed it could. The dead do not speak, but they have been spoken through, their bodies turned into bomb, their silence turned into healing. And for a while it was enough that the apothecary's door is closed now. The dust has settled. Outside, the wind moves gently across old stones, and within us the stories remain. So let your eyes close now. Let the shadows soften. Let the breath slow. The body rests, the past sleeps, and we are still here. Good night.